welcome to the Liberal Democrat History Group Fringe meeting. And the title of tonight's talk is Description of Liberalism, the ideas that built the Liberal Democrats. And we are full of ideas. Tonight we're very fortunate. We've got Professor Jonathan Parry. He's the author of Liberalism. I'm sure he'll tell you about it. And he's a Professor Emeritus of Modern British History at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Pembroke College, Cambridge. And our second speaker will be David Howarth, who was an MP along with me in 2005 to 2010. And he's a Professor of Law and Public Policy at the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. So we're going to hear from Professor Parry and then Professor Howarth, and then Duncan will have a few words, and then we'll have a discussion, if that's okay with you all. Right, so I'm going to hand over to you first. They each have 20 minutes. Professor Parry.
Good. Well, thank you. Can you hear me? So, how do you try to define liberalism? It's a word which has had all sorts of, it's had an extraordinary career as a word. You could start with some works of theory, and the obvious place would be John Stuart Mill, who helpfully wrote a book called On Liberty, and has been put in a select canon of authors who university courses tend to use to define liberalism. But I'm not going to do that. I'm a political historian, and so I study politics, and I spent quite a lot of my career thinking about liberalism as it's actually been practiced by politicians. And I don't think Mill's books were particularly influential on the history of the Liberal Party in practice. So when I was asked to write this short book about liberalism as an idea in politics, I couldn't really resist the challenge to think about it in terms of the political process itself and what political leaders have said that liberalism is about, and look at how they've managed to do that, even accepting all the compromises that politics necessarily entails. So how far can we generalise about liberalism as a particular approach to the business of politics and government? Can we identify some approaches that liberal leaders have shared over the last 2 centuries? I think we can, because I believe firmly that historically we shouldn't make an artificial distinction between thinkers and politicians. Thinkers, what are thinkers? What are these thinkers? For most of liberal history, politicians have been interested in thinking themselves. That's partly what defines a liberal in a way. So they have, most liberals, most of the time, have thought seriously about political issues, and for the 19th century they prided themselves on making long and relatively coherent political speeches and writing journal articles and pamphlets. So how do I define liberalism? Well, you could take a multifaceted thematic approach, which is the approach that the excellent booklet that Duncan is going to talk about a bit later does. But what I've tried to do is to reduce it to 2 big principles. And the first is a concern, perhaps even an obsession, with the process of politics. A concern to get the political process itself working properly, to make sure that the political system, the constitution, allows people to express their grievances and their demands, and that therefore people trust politics. And then secondly, it follows from that, a focus therefore on trying to stop vested interests obstructing the efficient workings of politics. These might be landlords, these might be political cliques, these might be large businesses, these might be religious bodies that have acquired too much power and need to be checked. But vested interests are always with us. We think of at least 20 at any one time that we might find offensive. So liberals have always had to choose specific political reforms and specific political adjustments to check the particular concentrations of power that seem most offensive or that seem best suited to organising a campaign against, to try to rectify some of these abuses and to restore some sort of balance to the political process and confidence that politics is working. So I agree with all those who say that liberalism is about freedom, but I think a more fundamental liberal value is an obsession with fairness in the political process and opposing particular vested interests in order to achieve that, because the freedoms that seem most important to defend against the most powerful vested interests and monopolies will change over time. In other words, I'm proposing a political rather than an economic definition of liberalism. And I think this is important because prioritising economics, and particularly prioritising laissez-faire as an economic principle, leads to a fundamental misconception about liberalism in politics, which I'll come back to. It's the second thing I want to talk about. But before I do that, just generally on these big themes, one important question is when the Liberal Party actually began. And 1859 has often been seen as the beginning, and there are three reasons why that is. The first was that 1859 saw the reunification of a party which had been divided between two cliques, between supporters of Palmerston and the supporters of Lord John Russell. The second was that 1859 was the moment that Gladstone really became a proper liberal and moved away from Peel and the Conservative Party. And the third was that after it, there's no question that everybody used the word liberal to describe the party rather than other names like Whig or Reformer, which had been quite common before. So these things are all significant. But each of them can actually be qualified. The name liberal had been used a lot before 1859, in fact, right back to the 1830s, as well as Whig and Reformer. The party was particularly badly divided in the 1850s, but frankly it was always quite divided. It was always quite disorganised throughout the 19th century. Sort of liberals like to disagree about things, as you know. And Gladstone undoubtedly brought something new to the party, but he also adapted to its existing culture in order to fit in. There were already powerful pre-existing values that he could work with. So more fundamental than these 3 points, I think, are the continuities back to the 1830s, and the beginning of liberal history to me is the 1832 Reform Act, which I see as the first major piece of liberal political reform. It's important in itself, but it's also important because it created an effective two-party system. From the mid-1830s, a Liberal Party emerges which behaves in a particular way, and it has to respond to the grievances of the electoral supporters that it has collected. Parties divide on three major issues in the 1830s, and this reflects the fact that three groups are much more powerful as a result of the Reform Act than they'd ever been before. And those were towns, the interests of towns and the economic interests of those towns, the interests of Protestant dissenters or nonconformists, and the interests of Irish Roman Catholics. So from the 1830s, it's not really possible to be a liberal without sympathising to some degree with each of those three sets of grievances, and the Liberal Party has to respond to a lot of pressures coming up from each of those three groups, and it has to decide how far to respond to. So that is the Liberal Party for me from the 1830s, and whether you call it Whig or Liberal is frankly not very important. It is the sense that it has to respond to popular anxieties and feelings. Ever since then, Liberal Party crusades have usually been against whatever vested interests seemed most important at the time. Parliamentary reform began as a movement in the early 19th century or late 18th century against the excessive power of the monarch and his ministers to rein that in under George III. In the 19th century, local government reform was an attack on the vested interests that ran most of the corporations that were in power in most towns of the country, very self-electing corporations. So in 1835 you have the first election of municipal councillors instead. Religious pluralism has been fundamental to liberalism, critique of the excessive power of the Anglican Church in rural Britain and Protestant landlordism in Ireland, and a defence of the rights of minorities, Protestant nonconformists and Roman Catholics. And then you have other powerful interests at times needing to campaign against, famously, the landed interest and the Corn Laws, the Edwardian tariff movement, the political power of the House of Lords. Talking about parliamentary reform, it's nearly always been an unavoidable part of the Liberal tradition, and is usually called reform with a capital R to reflect that. The focus on reform would wax and wane over time, depending on the degree of enthusiasm or the degree of anxiety about it from the Liberal grassroots, from the constituencies. Liberals often disagreed how much reform was needed or how much was practical politics. But on the whole, Liberal politics throughout the 19th and early 20th century could not resist drifting with the development of popular feeling. The reason why we have a democracy is because of the succession of reform acts. At the time of 1832, most Liberals would have been horrified by what happened in the end. They weren't Democrats, they were nothing like Democrats. But once you set up a process in which Liberals have to respond to what is coming out of the constituencies, then there is inexorably over time, and with all sorts of political hiccups, a movement towards that democracy. So I'm really just stressing that through the 19th century, the Liberal Party was a particular sort of party that had to deal with these various popular interests and often disagreed about how much exactly to do that, hence the difficulties of Liberal politics. And of course, ultimately you have the issue of the trade unions, which was a very major problem for Liberals to deal with in the early 20th century, and was of course the major reason for the emergence of the Labour Party. So the second thing I want to talk about briefly then is this question of how important or unimportant classical economic liberalism, free markets, laissez-faire, how important that has been to liberalism. As most of you will know, in 2004, the Orange Book was published, edited by Paul Marshall, no longer, I think, a Liberal Democrat.
He was a Liberal.
Yeah, yes. And David Laws, who is, I
Yes, for certain.
and the Orange Book claimed that there was a great division among Liberals, between classical Liberals and social Liberals. And this division, this idea of a distinction, has often been made since, but I don't think historically it's a very accurate observation. I don't believe that any active political Liberal, any active Liberal politician can afford to be a classical Liberal, can afford to be a laissez-faire dogmatist or neoliberal in today's parlance. All liberalism, it seems to me, is social liberalism, in that, if you want to use that phrase, rather than classical liberalism, in the sense that its political objectives always have to be justified in terms of a social purpose, because the essence of liberalism is improving public contentment with politics. Politicians have to respond to grievances, to legitimate the state, to legitimise politics, and this often requires interventions in the economy. So going back to the 1840s, Lord John Russell's Liberal government, and then in the 1880s, Gladstone's government, both interfered with principles of freedom of contract and gave protections to factory workers. Russell's government was the first to give adult factory workers protections against employers. And then in the 1880s, Gladstone with agricultural workers and agricultural tenants. So it's Liberal governments that introduced these effective checks on hours of adult labour and in favour of employee rights. So somebody like T.H. Green, who's often held up as a liberal theorist, a new liberal theorist, one of the founders of a new approach to liberalism, his argument for interventions in the economy in 1880 were in fact just a justification of what Gladstone had just done in his own legislation, and most liberal writings are in fact much more grounded in the context of the day than we might think. They shouldn't be taken out of context. In the first half of the 19th century, liberalism was primarily about reducing the role of the state. But this was not because of classical liberal dogmatism. It was because there was a sense that there was a particular set of popular grievances, that the state in the hands of the existing elite was a gigantic vested interest, that it was hogging people's taxes, and that the elite in politics were spending those taxes on themselves, on their class, on patronage and on sinecures, So if you were a radical politician in the first half of the 19th century, you would be attacking this elite class. You'd be attacking it either because of its appropriation of tax for patronage and sinecures, or because landowners were keeping up the corn laws, or because there was heavy-handed policing or use of the army to suppress civil liberties and so on. So these were the major political issues for most 19th century radicals. So they naturally talk a language of hostility to an overpowerful state. And they particularly use this phrase, old corruption, to discuss that. And the purpose of parliamentary reform is to try to sweep that away. And also, of course, with the West Indian slave owners who perpetuated slavery. So liberalism seems to be a movement against the state. But once these things are stamped out, and they were all stamped out by the 1850s, or earlier, certainly, completely by 1870, then it was natural for radicals to respond to suggestions that the state might do more for the average voter. And so as soon as the state enjoys more political legitimacy through the Reform Acts, particularly after 1867, you get liberals emerging who argue that the state should do more, intervene more, because it wouldn't now be acting in the interest of the few, but in the interest of the many. And already, I think, by the 1880s, you could see there's this inexorable drift towards arguing for that in particular ways. So the argument for less or for more state intervention, these are not incompatible. They're only incompatible if you see economic theory as somehow determining your attitude to politics. They're both, in fact, responses to political grievances which are very strongly held at the time. And what's often called the new liberalism of the period around 1900 was a movement led by some writers and thinkers in the Rainbow Circle who defined themselves against classical liberal intellectuals from earlier generations, people like Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, who talked of the free market as a great machine. So Herbert Samuel actually invented the phrase new liberalism. And Herbert Samuel claimed that these writers had a narrowly mechanical view of political economy, and he said, this is all wrong, we need to invest politics with ethical purpose. But my point is that Smith and Bentham are not actually relevant to anything other than what Smith and Bentham wrote about. They don't define what the Liberal Party under Russell or even Palmerston did. And so, if you actually anchor your analysis in practical politics, then you see that actually Samuel is guilty of overemphasizing the importance of intellectuals, and he's exaggerating the difference that there needs to be away from a classical liberalism to a new liberalism, whereas in fact, on the ground, things are much more nuanced. Moving to the 20th century, I would argue, in fact, but I defer to some people in the room who probably know more about some of this. I would argue that liberals have always tended to have a problem with economic policy, precisely because they don't have an ideological conception of economic politics. The great crisis of liberalism came in World War I and the 1920s, and then once the Liberals rolled down to Labour, the great problem that the party faced from the 1920s to the 1960s was that they did not adopt a simplistic view of the economy. They criticised both the other parties for being far too simplistic, and Labour saying, we need to have more state control, with the Tories saying, the unions and the socialists are ruining everything. And Liberals protested against this way of conducting politics, which they said led to shrill opposing policies. Whereas what was needed was something much more consensual, something much more collaborative, something that recognised the strength but also the limitations of both economic models. And of course they argued for proportional representation in order to moderate that shrill discourse between these two opposing views of the economy. And of course the reasons that Liberals didn't get very far was that most voters between the 20s and 60s were quite content with seeing politics as fundamentally a battle between capital and labour. More recently, as I said, the great debates about the Orange Book were greatly overblown, and there's been, as everybody knows, more difficulty ever since the 1990s, I suppose, for liberals to define themselves on economics because of the narrowing of the difference between the parties on economics. And I can't think of any liberal leader who has ever been happy with the idea of central bureaucratic control of the economy. I think the Liberal Party is still fundamentally anti-socialist in that respect. And Grimm and Ashdown both said very critical things about central state control, and Ashdown talked about socky corporatism. But at the same time as being fundamentally anti-socialist, liberals have always strongly opposed monopoly capitalism, the excessive power of big business. So, the last point, that seems to me that it's more helpful to see liberal economic politics as really political, really more concerned with microeconomic adjustments to the tax system to bring about political outcomes that they want to support, beginning with death duties in the 1890s, hypothecating taxes for national insurance in 1911, the extra penny on the income tax for health or education more recently. And that seemed actually a more reasonable, very realistic way of thinking about what politicians can actually do to help the economy. So the question is whether liberals can find a cause today to do these things. And of course it's more serious than before because there is another party which quite deliberately positions itself as reform with a capital R. And however illiberal, populist and immigrant bashing it may be, it's idle to deny that reform with a capital R is tapping a lot of the disillusionment with the political process that reformers with a capital R tapped in the first half of the 19th century. And Lib Dems need to find a way of redirecting that disillusionment.
Thank you, that was very cleverly knitted together at the end. Very nifty. Right, over to you, David.
You
want some water? Water first. Okay, there we go.
Great, so I think what I'd better say first is I agree with John. But I certainly agree with him about the place of economics in liberalism. I think liberalism has virtually nothing to do with economics, and that came very clear in the Working Party on Economic Policy I chaired. But I suppose the main point that John's trying to put across is that liberalism, capital L liberalism, it's not a set of doctrines, it's the ideas of the political movement built around the party, built around the Party of Democrats. Though I suppose it's worth saying, as a qualification to what John said, that some of these major figures, major intellectual figures, were themselves active politicians. Mill was a member of Parliament, was not except for one-term members of Parliament. As was Beveridge, another one-term. Beveridge, Keynes, Conrad Russell were all Liberal peers. T.H. Green was an Oxford councillor. Right? And then, even Hobhouse supported the party as an active leader writer and journalist until he drifted off. And talking about that economic policy document in 1991, I was very heavily influenced by James Mead. And James Mead heavily influenced Martin Wheel, who was my main source of macroeconomic wisdom, obviously totally ignored at the time and since. And James Mead was an active party supporter in South Cambridgeshire. And so these categories of thinker and practical politician are permeable. But it is true that lots of the ideas of the party come from people who are not major figures outside it, but they are major figures inside it. So Elliot Dodds, 30s and 40s, but more in our time, Bernard Greaves, Gordon Lishman, and David Boyle. I saw Gordon Lishman earlier, and he assured me he wasn't coming, so I can say lots of things about him. That's not to say that ideas from outside the party can't influence it, but I don't think any liberal politician reads a book and says, "Oh, that's what we should do. Let's all be fascists now." That's not what happens. I think what we read is filtered through a set of instincts, through a disposition, liberal disposition, in a a similar sense to Michael Oakeshott's attempt to produce a conservative disposition in the 1950s. And what I've been writing about is that, actually. I've written a whole book about liberal disposition. Hasn't got a publisher yet. So any publishers out there, there's a really interesting book. And in fact, I might say a couple of words about what I think the liberal disposition is, because I think it affects the way the party thinks about issues. The first thing is its openness to new ways of thinking, new ways of living. So openness is a fundamental liberal instinct. And the second is hatred of the abuse of power. This is John's theme as well. Just cannot bear seeing power being abused. It's not a thought, it's a reaction, it's an instinct. Then there's an attitude of live and let live. This is Lynn's thing. It says in one of her books, I'm a live and let live kind of person. Yeah. And it's live and let live in a generous way. It's not withdrawing from social relationships. It's something you actively bring to a relationship. The fourth, and this echoes John's point about not being socialists. I think the main instinct there is to treat people as individuals, not as members of groups or collectivities. I just hate being classified and hate classifying other people. And that's what divides us from the Labour Party more than almost anything else. Anyone who's sat in a council, listened to Labour councillors speechify, they're always classifying, they're always treating people as group members, not as individuals. It used to drive me mad in this situation. The fifth is an anti-hierarchical feeling, democratic in the social sense, not just the institutional sense, of not liking people, very boasty, and think of themselves as above other people. This party hated Boris Johnson. It doesn't hate him because of his policies, it just hates Boris Johnson. The sixth is, this is Keynes. Keynes on Asquith. Keynes said, I always think of Asquith as a cool sort of person. That liberalism is cool. What he meant by that was rational. But it's not rational in a kind of pure cerebral sense. It's trying to be rational, trying to be cool, trying not to be carried away by passion. Doesn't always succeed, but that liberal cool, I think, is really important. And the seventh is the one I don't have, which is moderation and always looking for compromise. The party is always like this, always trying to say, well, you looked at it the other way, could we make compromise here, could we moderate something there? Not my stuff, but the party's like that, right? And that instinct for moderation and compromise, I think is quite important the way we react to things. So I think that both theory and practice are affected by these instincts. But I'm quite interested in the way in which theory and practice interact in general, because I think that quite often people assume that, as John said, that politicians read works of political theory and then suddenly they say, oh yes, let's put them into operation, that sounds like my kind of thing. But that's not the way I think it works at all. And lots of things don't work this way. Engineering doesn't work that way, by the way. Instead, practice can precede the theory. The history works from practice to theory. And the way in which the theory is formed is it's formed out of what we're already doing. And then we kind of think about whether, because we're kind of cool sort of people, we then try and think about whether it makes sense. Right? And that theorizing is trying to make sense of what we're already doing. And then that theory itself then affects our practice, and then and so the circle goes round and round. This is what John Rawls called reflective equilibrium, at least if it succeeds in balancing itself out. I should say, I don't think there's any final state of this equilibrium. I think there's always a state of disequilibrium between your practice and your theorizing about practice. And so my favourite philosopher is not John Rawls, this Benedetto Croce. Actually, we won't read his theories of history, which are mad. but it's all about adjusting to a new situation where there are new threats from above, new threats from people who are trying to systematise the world and to crush the spirit of individuals, which is very close to what John was saying. But I thought, instead of just talking about these generalities, I'd mention two examples, just to think about the interaction between theory and practice. One example is community politics, and the other example is Mills-Hahn principle, which both figure in our policy documents. So just start with community politics. The ideology of community politics, as Bernard and Gordon say in their famous pamphlet of 1980, The Theory and Practice of Community Politics, if that phrase it, is that liberalism includes creating a habit of participation, binding a community together in a constant relationship with power and decision making. And that's very close to John's first theme. It's the idea that democracy flourishes when people take part in it and perishes when it simply becomes a performance that people watch. It's also the idea that politics itself is concerned with the process, but more than that, is concerned with being involved in politics. Politics itself can bind people together in a common enterprise despite differences of opinion. And that there's no need for extreme forms of identity politics to form communities. Now, and you can talk about the intellectual roots of that ideology. You can see it in Mill's representative government. You can see it in T.H. Green. Back to T.H. Green, who John Meadowcroft once claimed in an article in the journal Liberal History as the original community politician. But actually, at the time, people here might remember. Enough grey hair. At the time, the leading theorist, who was quoted in young liberal circles, and whose pamphlets about whom appeared on the young liberal stall, was the Russian anarchist Peter Prokopkin. Right? Ian Brody Brown remembers.
I published it.
Exactly. So there's this marvellous phrase of Keynes where he says that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And I suppose in the formation of the theory of community politics, Green probably counts as defunct. He's there in the background, but no one really thought about it. Mill on democracy, as opposed to Mill on liberty, would be only half remembered in the late 60s and the 70s. But the one who was, the theorist who was actively in people's heads was Kropotkin. And it's also worth talking about 1968. Right? This is when a lot of the energy behind community politics was first formed. Right? 1968, Les événements de mai, the student uprisings in Paris, big effects on young liberals. Bernard had an amazing giant hairdo, massive beard. There was just, it looked like some situationist or a reader of Guy Debord. Right? And there's a sense in which community politics is a moderate response to the revolutionary politics of 1968. It's our way of liberalising 68, putting individual participation at the heart, not class conflict, ethnic conflict, and recognising that politics is about how we live together. But it's not about how to live apart. This is why liberalism in this party has never been libertarianism. And the way I tend to think about this now, because thinking about Paris in '68, the CIS and the riots, it's very urban. It's very urban scene. liberalism is regardless of what you might think now, liberalism is an urban doctrine. It's about how to live together when we live on top of one another, as opposed to the American libertarian doctrines, which are all about how to live on the open plains, which are now, well, I suppose they're open because their original inhabitants have been removed, but not on top of one another. So Ayn Rand is not really about, it's not a possible way of living in a real urban society. So that's the theory, but there's also the political practice. What was the theory and practice of community politics about? Its main theme, from the first paragraph all the way through, is that community politics is not merely a technique for winning local elections. Right? And that dispute's still going. Notice ALDC in its history of community politics doesn't even mention the ideology. It just says it's a really good way of winning local elections. and that dispute goes back to the late 60s as well. It goes back to the Weymouth Conference of the YLs, and the famous, well, it was the Putney resolution to withdraw the YLs from the party. But also a dispute about Wallace Lawler. Wallace Lawler, Liberal MP, elected at Birmingham Ladywood, was one of the, has a good claim to be one of the original community politicians. But his campaigning was thought by quite a few people in the YLs to be racist, to be a kind of local populism of the sort we're now seeing. And there were enormous ructions about this, and motions that were, well, the debates that lasted for days in the great style of the Italian Radical Party. And no obvious conclusion was reached. But you can see what the purpose of the writing about community politics was. The purpose of the writing about it was to try and take the idea of community politics away from the more populist and rather dangerous form which it took in the hands of Wallace Lawler. Right? And that's still going. Right? So here's political practice and thought interacting almost every year since. So that's my first example. The second example is Mill's harm principle. I presume you all know Mill's harm principle. You should do, so I won't read it out. And it's not just to do with legal compulsion. It's to do with the way we treat one another in social relationships. It's about law or opinion. Right? So it's not coercing people either by law or by opinion. It's actually about cancelling. That's what the harm principle is about, what we now call cancelling, as well as being about oppressing people by legal methods as well. And the harm principle relates to our instincts as liberals think, because it kind of sets the limit to live and let live. I mean, you do live and let live, and when do you stop doing live and let live? At what point can you say, well, okay, that's enough. Let's bring this to a conclusion and be a bit more authoritarian, not just in legal terms, but in personal terms. And the problem of the harm principle is we've never really been clear where that limit actually comes. It's kind of interesting that if you look at Lib Dem policy documents, Christian's not here, but don't look the harm principle is quoted in vast numbers of policy papers. And obviously he thinks in the party's core values documents. It's in policy papers on civil liberties, on drugs, on prostitution. But it keeps cropping up in other places. Well, I found a reference to it in a housing policy paper, where our policy on second homes, the document declares, our guiding approach is John Stuart Mill's harm principle. That which doesn't harm others should be permitted. Second homes, it says, in many cases don't cause any problems for the community, and we have no desire to penalise these people. When they do start to cause harm to the community, action must be taken. Right? So It gets everywhere. But the question is this really stable now? Has the world changed, the political practice changed, in a way that makes the harm principle difficult to apply? So Martin will remember the debates in the parliamentary party around the 2006 health bill about smoking, where both sides, the kind of let people smoke and the other side, let's stop all smoking, in all circumstances. I did rebel, by the way, on that bill, because I found myself voting to allow smoking in tobacco shops, which I thought would be reasonable. Ended up in the eye lobby with about 5 other people who mainly consisted of the Tory chief whip and his mates. Shocking. But what was interesting about that debate was that both sides used the harm principle to justify their position. And the people who were in favour of more strict controls on smoking said that the harm principle included costing the health service money, or costing other people emotionally upset. And there's a question about where you get to if you allow harm to include financial harm to the government's budgets, because almost anything can count as harm in that case. And I think since that debate, I think there's been a bit of a crisis about exactly where the harm principle can be, how it can be applied. And more recent debates about people feeling unsafe and words making them feel unsafe. That's also part of the same problem about what counts as harm. But I still think our instinct is to say we want to do live and let live. Right? That's our instinct. So the driving instinct is to find a way in which we can resolve these disputes in a way that allows us to say that we are liberal kind of people who do not want to interfere in other people's lives in any excessive way. But we are at this very moment working out in our political practice precisely what we now mean by harm. It says 2 minutes. There's only 10 seconds left. What we mean by harm in a whole range of policy areas. And the next round of theorising about harm, or about what replaces the harm principle, will come out of those debates and decisions and thoughts that we have. So the next round of theory will be driven by the current round of practice.
Thanks to both of you. I have to say I never thought about any of that when I joined the Lib Dem.
But she did say I was a live and let live kind of person, a natural liberal. And she's right.
It's so true.
Practice precedes theory.
Yeah.
Before we go into questions and discussion, Duncan
Just
would
a
like
quick
to say a
commercial
few
break
words.
on behalf of the Liberal Democrat History Group. My name is Duncan Brack, editor of the Journal of Liberal History. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we were founded as the History Group when this party was set up in 1988, and our purpose is to encourage discussion and research of the history of the Liberal Democrats and the Liberal Party and the SDP, our predecessors. And we do this in 4 main ways, through meetings like this one. Our next meeting will be in January or February in the National Liberal Club in London. We're still sorting out what the title will be, but if you sign up to our mailing list, we'll let you know what the subject is. And we will have another fringe meeting at the next conference, Spring Conference in York in March. We have a website, liberalhistory.org.uk, where you can see everything we do. Of course, we published the Journal of Liberal History, our flagship publication. This is the latest issue, just hot off the press. It has, the lead article is a piece by John Curtis, the famous psephologist, on the Lib Dem performance in the local elections in May, because that was 4 months ago, so that's history. And a bigger article on the Manchester Liberal MPs in the first Labour government, and the findings of a survey we carried out about of leading Liberal Democrats, their political influences, type of books and authors, some interesting reflections from what our speakers were talking about. You can subscribe to this in either print or digital forms, and you can see it at our stand in the exhibition. And then the last thing is we publish a range of publications. So this meeting is launching our latest one, Liberalism, the Ideas That Built the Liberal Democrats. And what we do is we try to provide an accessible guide to the key ideas underlying the party's beliefs, kind of things people have been talking about. So we have a long introduction talking about the 6 themes that we believe underlie British political liberalism: liberty, equality, community, democracy, internationalism, and environmentalism, and then explore how they have been expressed by different groups and in different contexts throughout the last 300 years of liberal history. So we have sections on the Whigs, radicals, Peelites, classical liberals, social liberals, new liberals, social democrats, etc., etc. And of course, we'd like to sell it to you, along with John's excellent book, Liberalism, which is, he's described what it's about. It's quite different in approach from our booklet. The two are highly complementary, with kind of coming at the same issue in completely different ways. You can buy copies here. We normally sell all our publications to journal subscribers at 20% discount. We're selling to anybody here in this meeting at 20% discount. So the booklet is £6 instead of £7.50. The book is £16 instead of $19.99. And if you buy the two together, it's £20. So amazing bargain, and you can get them at the end. And then please come to see us in the stall in the exhibition area, talk about what we do. If you'd like to help us run the group, we're always looking for help from people. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Duncan.
Didn't say liberals don't understand economics.
I understand business.
Whether they're cheaper to buy the two together.
So we'll go into questions or discussion. Hands up. Oh God, okay. Do you like 3 at a time or 1 at a time so you can focus? Well, let's start with Ben and we'll see how we go. We've got half an hour, so
Yeah,
we've
depends
got
how much
time
time
to
there is.
do it.
So I'm afraid sort of probably 2 slightly more comments, or is it not a fact type question?
Would you not agree then?
So I'm struck by the harm principle as your starting point for everything. If that's a starting point, then we're way, way earlier, of course, than J.S. Mill, because that's the fundamental doctrine of pretty much every major faith, and it's called the Golden Rule.
No, I was about, in the book, basically what I say is the way out of the problem is to go back to the Golden Rule, go back to reciprocity.
That was a sort of a aside, but I was sort of drawn in by your sort of contrasting sort of reform and liberalism, and I've sort of struggled in the past to give credit to reform of having any sort of philosophy whatsoever. But listening to you, I wonder if there is, and I wonder if it really is even more the anti-liberal philosophy, in that both parties start from a position that you can't trust the politicians. Their solution is therefore trust us, and our solution is therefore trust no one. And I'm interested whether you think, probably more of a question for David, whether there's a political argument there that allows us to have a slightly more intellectual debate with reform.
Okay, David first. I'll do one question at a time at the moment.
Well, there's some interesting research just been done by Best for Britain about the different sorts of reform curious voter. And some of them are, in a way, they're the kind of people who will be drawn to community politics in the way that Wallace Law did it. They are disillusioned with the way things are working locally, and they can be drawn into blaming this person or that person, this that group, but they could easily be drawn away to something more constructive. So there's certainly a kind of overlap there. But on the other side of the reform movement, there are utterly destructive, almost nihilistic thoughts of people, where I don't think there's any kind of dialogue you can have with them. Just thinking about my list of liberal instincts, liberal disposition. The reformers, Reform UK people, certainly not open. They kind of have some kind of idea of the abuse of power, not liking it. They're certainly not live and let live. They tend to treat themselves as individuals and other people as groups. They are drawn to arrogant, boasting leaders and as our leaders have found. They are not cool. They're not trying to be rational. They're exploiting fear, or being afraid. And they certainly aren't interested in moderation or compromise. So they are non-liberals. I have a whole section in the book about whether non-liberals are fascists, and they're not. Fascists are different. You have to go further in lots of ways. But the idea that they are kind of the opposite of us, with the one exception of not liking the abuse of power by politicians. It's pretty close. They are pretty close to the opposite.
Yeah, well, I agree with all that. You put it much better than I could. I hope you didn't think that I was suggesting that reform had a coherent philosophy. I don't.
As a liberal, I'm still struggling to find one.
Yes,
I would accept it.
I was just very struck by their borrowing of the word, because I do think it is. Somebody, I don't know how it. Does anybody know how it emerged as a word? I mean, but I think they were definitely tapping something from the 19th century. However incoherently they were sort of doing it, and they knew what they were doing. But yes, I mean, insofar as it's more than immigrant bashing, it is a despair. It's picking up on a despair that nothing works, that the country is going to rack and ruin, and that those in charge have failed. And so when you say they believe in trusting us, I mean, it will be interesting if that actually continues, because it seems to me already, Farage disagrees with anybody who doesn't trust him. I mean, it is a dictatorship in a way in that party, and so the question of who us is for reform is an interesting one. But really, their instincts are the instincts of the sort of, without sounding condescending, I mean the sort of the Sun leader writer on a bad day, sort of common sense, which isn't usually common sense at all, but things that should be done differently, and somehow if sensible people were put in charge, then it would all be much simpler and more straightforward. So, I mean, that's not what I regard as a philosophy, but it does seem to be very powerful. And I'm constantly alarmed by the number of quite rational people who seem to have fallen to it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. Can you say your name? I forgot. Ben, say your name. Who?
Sorry, Ben Rich.
Okay, now Martin.
Martin Horwood. And David, the reason you were in the wrong lobby on the tobacco thing was because you forgot about the shop assistant. That was the harm principle the rest of us tried to explain to you in the bar afterwards.
I was saying, who would choose to work in a tobacconist?
Not choose. I once had the hilarious job of trying to explain to our new French and Romanian colleagues in the European Parliament why some of the liberal principles that the rest of us called liberal principles, and actually very much on the lines that John said, of distrust of the concentration of power in the hands of abusive elites and vested interests, really were what they believed and were liberal. But they hated the word liberal because they associated it with American conservative economics, which was ironic because American conservative economists thought that liberal meant socialist, so it's a difficult word sometimes.
I'm very confused.
But one of the other ideas we really agreed on was that these kind of values and instincts transcended national boundaries, and that you shouldn't take too seriously these kind of arbitrary national boundaries that had emerged from 19th century great power politics and nationalism, and that therefore that informed our attitude to everything from international aid to human rights to the international rule of law. And it was a distrust of sovereignty, and that of course is, we're seeing in the flags everywhere at the moment. This is an obsession on the new populist right, both in America and around the world. Neither of you have talked much about that idea of internationalism or sovereignty, and I just wondered if you'd like to add to that.
Yes, well, I mean, it does feature in my book. Yes, I I mean, I see it. It comes out of the 19th century in the sense that Britain, which was then top dog, nonetheless wanted the world to be organised in a way that suited its own definition of what liberal principles were, including free trade and constitutionalism, and as long as the world was going in those directions, then I don't think liberals wanted to make a great distinction between national interests and internationalism. I mean, they tended to think that internationalism was what the British wanted the world to look like, and particularly in the era of Palmerston. I mean, Palmerston was a genuine liberal in many ways, but at the same time, it was all very much we are top dog. But yes, internationalism as a distrust of sovereignty. I mean, it's very striking already by the 1930s, Ramsay Muir, and then the 50s, Grimond. They're very strong on the argument that you can't trust anybody who talks about sovereignty because it's a ridiculous fantasy. And in the modern world, we need to be more rational and cool about these things. If we're going to advance any of the interests we have as a nation or any of the non-nationalists. I mean, I think, going back to your question, liberals have always tried to ride two horses at the same time when it comes to national interest. I don't think most liberal politicians have succeeded if they have claimed that internationalism was not also in the national interest. I think that the challenge is trying to make them fit together. And then Tim Farron, of course, spent 20 minutes doing that this evening.
I like when you said two horses, because it is a two-horse race.
Yeah.
Well, I think in terms of the liberal disposition, the internationalism, Europeanism, comes from the first, comes from openness. Comes from being open to new ideas, open to other ways of life, other ways of living. And it's a kind of political expression. There are these practical aspects to it. As part of moderation and compromise, you need to work with people in other countries. It's also part of treating people as individuals, thinking that national boundaries are sort of artificial. So it's drawing on lots of liberal, parts of the liberal disposition. But it goes back to John's first one about the word liberal. That in France, libéral means free market obsessive. That's a literal translation. And the party that's nearest to us, the Parti Radical, totally destroyed one of the Fifth Republic's electoral system, right? Because it didn't want to be in a two-block system and ended in two parts itself. But in the US, liberal has become, well, I'll tell you a little incident that I was involved in, which I'll put in my book. In February this year, there's this weird headline appeared briefly in the New York Times, the web version, which said something like, German election results bring joy to some liberals. I thought, what's this? Because the FDP had been completely smashed. Deservedly so, actually, because they'd gone from liberalism to being libéral, right? And so I thought, what's this story about? And so you read the story, and it's about the relative success of Die Linke, the left party, which actually is the successor to the East German Communist Party. Right? The Socialist, because the Social Unity Party. I mean, only in America could success for the East German Communist Party be described as pleasing liberal. So the word in the US has gone completely weird. It just means lefty. And obviously there's no party called that. So there was one in New York and it collapsed. So they're these completely opposite views, the kind of Ayn Rand and East Germany. Apparently both liberal.
Excellent. Okay, so it was your turn.
Nigel Taylor. Continuing the international theme, in America, liberal is often used as a term of derision, certainly from the right wing. In Canada, it's the name of the principal left-of-centre party. In Australia, it's the name of the principal right-of-centre party. How has the same name got so many different interpretations in different countries?
Liberally interpreted.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
Well, it kind of depends on when these parties start. I think in the Canadian Liberal Party is much older than the Australian Liberal Party, and is just a kind of British Liberal Party translated into Canadian circumstances in many ways, and it's certainly not liberal. And its political positions are, recognisably liberal, but they're even more compromised by having been in power for a very long time. The Australian Liberal Party is actually far more recent than that, and it took that name because that would be a popular name, right? If you're founding a new party in the 1930s or 40s, it was thought to be a nice name to have, would attract a certain sort of voter, which it's in recent elections Australia lost. It lost the Liberal voters to the Teal Independents, because they're kind of centre right centre type green liberals, and so there's it kind of depends on the point in time which you try to take the name. I have no idea what happened in the US. It's just weird. But I was just trying to think the other day about the American meaning of the word liberal would cover which parties in the European Parliament. It would cover nearly everybody, apart from the far right. The green left people, they'd be liberal, but even the kind of People's Party would be liberal. And it's just an extraordinary kind of breadth of reference. It just makes no sense.
John?
Well, I didn't really have anything to add, so let's move on.
Okay, who's next? It was you, wasn't it?
Thank you. My name's Graham. Obviously, the most important aspect of a liberal history is having a liberal future, so we have a future point to look back on the party as is. And one of the things I've been thinking about most, and trying to propose this question for the last 20 minutes or so, is the way in which we position ourselves as a party within the current political structure, and especially in regards to the electorate. So the Conservative Party will listen to their members, but as long as they're rich enough. Labour Party will listen to their members and then continue to do what they like to do anyway. We are the party of participation. We actually have an expectation of our membership to be able to stand up and actually help win seats. We actively seek that. But we are aware of polls where younger generations are being faced with a very slick approach from Reform, who have basically got the high ground when it comes to the digital landscape and getting their message out, and they offer something quite attractive, and that is, don't worry, we'll just do it. They offer simple answers to complex solutions, and effectively will not listen to people, and a lot of people are finding that quite attractive. How do we get our message out that actually the best way forward is to actually get off your bums and do something about it? Because that isn't seen as attractive as being told that, don't worry, we'll see to it.
Okay, John.
Well, I of course I can't answer that question.
Sorry, it's a
and
fungible
you're in
question.
a much better position, some of you, to answer it than I am. But I am struck. I mean, it seems to me the best card for the Lib Dems is their local presence, and the fact that Lib Dems can make local politics work. And we are very good at trading on that in most of the seats that started as targets and now become fairly, at the moment, safe seats. So I don't doubt that is working as a principle. The question is how far it can be extended. And of course it is dependent on the Conservative Party continuing to implode in those seats, among those voters. If you're asking, are you asking how do Lib Dems start to position themselves among the 80% of seats where they got less than 15%? That's a very different question.
It's also far beyond my intelligence to
Well,
pose that question.
I mean, it seems to me that you're putting your finger on the real issue of whether enough people in most places are moved by the idea of political participation and community politics. And I don't know the answer to that. But it seems to me that Lib Dems have to be really insistent that that is the question that should be posed, and that active political participation and showing that communities can work for individuals in a rational sense is the best way of taking the fight to reform. That's all I can say.
David.
Well, there have always been people who are attracted to strong leaders with simple solutions, and we're against. Right? We're liberals. We're against that sort of thing. We really are. This almost defies. I mean, these mayors, elected mayors. Exactly. Just let them think of them. Just against that sort of thing. Right? This is a kind of strong leader. Just let me deal with it. Sort of model of politics that we're against. And the survey evidence, the polling evidence about young people is mixed. And there are some polling organisations that consistently show us as incredibly strong among 18 to 25-year-olds. And there are other polling organisations that show us not very strong. Just possibly that's just the techniques of the pollsters, or it might be just variability in the views of younger people. So, but I young people, students, have all sorts of different views, and shouldn't treat them as a block. Some of them will be raring to go to do the kind of liberal stuff we do, and others will be accepting of the strong leader model. And we just need to make sure that the people who are our sort of people whose disposition is liberal, know that we exist and come and work with us. So we've got to, we can't try to persuade fascists to be liberal.
Absolutely.
Right? What we should do is persuade liberals to come and work with the liberals.
You think like a liberal.
But you need more than liberals, don't you?
You do, but you've got to have someone working with you. And the collapse of the what I keep calling the legacy Conservative Party is kind of an important event. And there are a lot of people who have been Conservatives in that sense, who are kind of liberal enough.
One thing I wanted to add is that liberalism historically has been most successful when it has had a really simple cause, crusade even, and something that's easily comprehensible. And last year there was not such a cry, and the Lib Dems went out of their way not to have such a cry.
Yeah.
And I think there's maybe a certain amount of complacency that that's enough. I don't think that will be enough in the future. There needs to be a much more powerful, visceral idea of why you should be voting. And we need to find that.
We totally agree. There was someone over there.
Yeah.
It was you, wasn't it? Had your hand up,
So I've been kind of struggling to formulate this question, but I think it does lead on from what we were just talking about, because I really like the two definitions that really came from two of the things that you said about being a liberal, that it does kind of boil down to how do we learn to live together, but also live and let live. And they feel like logical, one logically follows from the other, and I think there's a really deep history of that goes way past the 19th century and goes outside of Europe as well. I think it's actually a lot more layered history as well. But I always wonder, particularly in the moment that we're in right now, where those things come into conflict. The live and let live principle can almost breed a kind of complacency, and where it ends up running up against our ability to live together, especially when we start to bring in concepts which we're not traditionally very comfortable with, things like class, which we're starting to run up against with the rise of reform. And I wonder, when we look at our party, we've traditionally had a lot of problem with diversity in terms of ethnicity. Is that a reflexive problem that we're starting to have in that tension about a complacency that means that we're not able to reflect the people that we're supposed to be channeling the anger of, if that makes sense?
Well, I was very struck because in the book I have a whole chapter about what I call pluralism in the 19th century context, which is about religion, about religious pluralism, about really going out of your way to make non-conformists and Catholics part of the political nation. But I am struck by the fact that it doesn't seem to me that Liberals and Lib Dems have had the same success with race as an issue. And it seems to me that race is much more of a problem for the party in the last 30, 40 years than class, as far as I can tell. And again, I don't know the answer to that, but it is quite striking that I think, well, maybe you could say something in terms of practical politics, but no, I mean Lynn.
Oh, me? Yes. Okay, I didn't know I was allowed to say anything.
I mean, I'm really interested in how
I think
Lib Dems have negotiated.
my
issues of
personal
race.
view
Yes.
is that if you're black, generally if you're black and poor, you automatically vote Labour, and if you're black and rich, you automatically vote Conservative, and somehow we've not been able to really get into that. I mean, a very simplified version, obviously, of reality. And in fact, I was at lunch today, I went and sat with a young black guy, and I asked him, and he's a Liberal Democrat and free thinker, and he agreed with that totally, and he said he was Labour, but he left Labour because they are too authoritarian and controlling, and he wanted to be Liberal. But that is relatively rare, and I think it's because it's so steep. So we have to find a way to address that, and I don't think we have. But I'm the chair, so what do you think?
Well, I think the instinct is to treat people as individuals, not as members of groups of any sort of classifications. And if you have politics defined in terms of those classifications, then we're going to look different. Right? And the appeal of other parties to those, based on those classifications, is going to be something that we just don't like, and we're just going to talk about something else. And I mean, it's very, very striking in a volume that Duncan organised in 1995, the Why Am I a Liberal Democrat volume, which is about people of the previous generation. One of the big themes in that is how much they hated class-based politics. Just couldn't stand it. And the great policy theme of the Yellow Book, the co-determination, works councils, two-tiered boards, that policy was built not just on a kind of rational notion of how to run an economy in a fairer, more productive way. It was built on just a hatred of class politics, the division. And I think our instincts are just to hate identity politics. But it's so unfashionable to say you hate identity politics that people just don't dare say it. But I hate identity politics. And my view on identity politics is, in identity politics, you cannot beat the far right. The far right, the Nazis, will always do identity politics more powerfully than anybody else. So if you're going to hand them victory, you go along with identity politics, and we shouldn't get involved in it, right? We just stick to individuals.
Okay, we've got 1.5 minutes left. So if there's are you a burning question?
No.
I don't know if you wanted a last 1 minute each.
No.
Okay, well,
We've said too much.
Ask your non-burning question then.
Yeah, okay. Hang on.
Sorry.
I'm slightly worried now because I've actually said this is not a particularly good question. How does this all fit in with the idea of building up a core vote? Because it strikes me, because you've talked about almost like liberalism, almost like as being a reflex.
Yeah.
And it also seems to me, and this may not be popular with people in here, but in a sense, some of the seats won last year was almost by luck. And there was a lack of, and you can see certain things in it. Maybe they tend to be quite nice areas. They probably tend to be areas which are probably a bit whiter than others. Probably areas where you've got less, the sort of the refugees, migrant issue is probably less in your face than maybe some areas in the east. Maybe some areas where unions have not been as strong in the past. But it strikes me that it's a bit lucky at the moment. You know, in one sense, why do you have Eastbourne that goes Lib Dem when you've got an area like Worthing where the Lib Dems were quite strong 40 years ago, they're just nowhere now. So I suppose what I'm saying is, can the Liberals ever have a core vote, or will it just change?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, the core vote is people with of a liberal disposition who just naturally think, or feel, it's actually more feel than think, in a liberal sort of way, and it's persuading them that we're their party, right? So that's a core vote. But the no bit is the vaguer is the first past the post system that can just lead to very strange results. Where was it a Cornwall council election? One of our candidates won with 19%. So you're right that some of these wins are kind of accidental, but also where tactical voting gets going. And it's one of the interesting problems with the study of voters, that tactical voting, especially for Labour, not for us, for Labour, is so great in 2024 that it's very difficult to say what a Labour voter is. Could be there's all sorts of different political ideas, but I all just wanted to get rid of it all.
Okay. John?
I'm a fan of talking about tactical voting. I'm also a fan of having my dinner.
Yeah.
About to say anything.
So that's a really good answer. I want to thank obviously both of our guests tonight. Really interesting, and all of you for such good questions. So thank you very much.